to start. Okay. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Can everyone... there we go. Hearing my voice so close to me. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's session. My name is Alan Wallace, and on behalf of the African Climate Foundation, the Institutes for Human Rights in Business, and the Ford Foundation, welcome to this first session of the morning on private sector standards and just energy transition partnerships. So today's session really delves quite deeply into JETPs. And JETPs, since COP26, when the South African JETP was announced, they've now emerged as quite an innovative model for national level decarbonization plans. And South Africa was first in this, having been announced in COP26, and then Vietnam and Senegal joined as well. So the purpose of today's session is to really focus on the private sector and unpack some of the key questions existing around key private sector social standards at play across South Africa's JETP. So, critical in today's discussion is the just element. So, we have to make sure, is to look at, sorry, I'm feeling a little bit, so today's session is going to really take us and let us look at the following questions. Does the just transition require us to rethink private sector standards? And how is the private sector engaging with emerging policies and frameworks like the just transition and the framework as developed by the Presidential Climate Commission? Have private sector standards influenced ways of working regarding the just transition framework? And are we seeing changes in the way the private sector is engaging with climate risk and transition risk? And finally, I think to really reflect on some of the challenges that we are seeing. I think lessons are being learned. The world's looking to South Africa. I think there are expectations for success. But I think we shouldn't be confusing pace and progress. So I'd just like us to think about the fact that as a country, the ambition is huge for the economy, for the private sector, and in a country that is dealing with the triple challenge of poverty, inequality, and unemployment, we are looking at a very complex space. So we are joined by a really fantastic panel, but before we introduce them and begin to the discussion, I'd like to invite Hayley St. Dennis from HRB, who's been working with the Ford Foundation and the African Climate Foundation on answering and exploring some of these questions.
Thank you so much, Alan. Thank you to ACF, really, especially for your tremendous leadership on so many of these very complex facets of climate action. It's such a privilege to be here today. My name's Hayley St. Dennis. I head up the Just Transitions program at the Institute for Human Rights in Business. We're a global think tank that works with all actors, so business, government, finance, and civil society, on the roles and responsibilities of the private sector to respect human rights, including across climate action contexts. Thank you very much to the South Africa Pavilion and everyone involved in organizing and facilitating this conversation today. We are close partners of both ACF and also the Ford Foundation. And it's actually led to a really interesting combination, I think, of sort of global partners and local partners working at the intersection of a real-time transition happening in a very ambitious way that has global implications and lessons for the rest of the world. And that's really, I think, what we're looking to elevate here today and sort of the spirit in which IHRB enters this conversation. Because I think two of the big challenges everyone is hearing constantly in COP at this COP28 in Dubai is that we're nowhere near the scale of finance mobilization required, but we're also not going to hit net zero by 2050 if there's social opposition slowing us down. And JETPs are really at the nexus between these two, right? They're the testing ground for how to mobilize sufficient capital whilst factoring in social issues so as not to undermine or delay the whole transition. And South Africa's Just Transition framework, its constitution, the different forms of justice recognized at the heart of the country's decarbonization, energy security, and development imperatives offers really important lessons on that complexity. So again, IHRB's sort of approach in this, the way we're looking at really trying to learn from South Africa, with the support of some excellent local experts at an organization called Better by Co-Design, are mapping the existing suite of corporate performance standards at play across the JETP value chain in South Africa. And we're trying to analyze those standards against the really live network of private sector actors, the relationships between them, the sort of feedback loops that drive the country's energy system. Because we want to understand how corporate standards and systems can be better utilized as levers to incentivize greater respect for human rights and inclusion of these just dimensions. So we think the answers to these questions could generate a few things. A more coherent ecosystem of private sector engagement that's actually incentivized to produce just outcomes, in concert, of course, with the sort of public and philanthropic efforts to date. I think greater comparability and consistency in assessing national level decarbonization efforts on what this just commitment really means in practice, and a foundation for driving greater monitoring, engagement, and accountability within JETPs by local civil society and workers and indigenous communities, but also across JETPs in any country really that's looking to ambitiously scale climate finance in a way that's in alignment with social outcomes. So thank you again, ACF. Thank you, Ford, very much for your partnership with us. And thank you very much to this excellent panel that's really composed of, I think, a cross-section of that complex ecosystem we're talking about, of the government role, the private sector role, and the civil society role, and really shaping what this could look like. And we're very excited to learn from you all today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Haley's. So now we're going to kick in, no pressure, said big questions, but I think really, as we have this conversation today, I think we've been using the word just elements of the transition, the just elements. And now I think we have to move from that rhetoric to the reality and how that's manifesting in real time. And I think it was very valid that Haley said we're looking at a just transition being implemented in real time. So I'm joined by a fantastic panel, and from left to right, I have Sue Lund from the Presidential Management Unit, who's working in the JET-IP team, so that's the Just Energy Transition Partnership team. I have Shamila Subramani from the National Business Initiative, the director, and I'm joined by Claude Kabemba from Southern Africa Resources Watch. So maybe to kick us off, before we delve into some of the specifics, can I ask each of you in about 2 or 3 minutes to maybe share your thoughts on what are the main transition risks businesses in South Africa face? But in thinking about that, how do we connect those to the transition risks faced by people, the economy, so workers, communities, indigenous groups? And how do these risk lenses differ and interrelate, if at all? So Sue, can I ask you to kick us off?
Sure. It's good to be with you, and thank you very much for inviting us to be part of this panel. I think that when we started developing the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, it was very much with this perspective that all stakeholders have to and must and need to play a critical role. So it isn't just a government process, it is about the whole of society. And that's because the risks of climate change in general affect, of course, every element of our society. And I think for business, it's both a commercial risk and a sustainability risk within their own working environment. So, you know, if their business is not seen to be legitimate, is not contributing to the well-being of the communities whose lives are affected, they will face difficulties, and we've seen that over and over again. But I think in South Africa that it's a deeply recognized issue that business and society are integrally linked. And I think, Shamila can speak to this more, but I think our business community is only too aware of the need to address these really fundamental challenges of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. And if we don't, then it's not a conducive environment for business. So there is a huge incentive for business to find a way to contribute. And I think, you know, business has done that in South Africa and continues to find ways of contributing to the just transition. And I'll speak a little bit later about, some of the initiatives that are underway and the role that we've seen for business to play in the just transition, and we think it's a very central role. But I suppose the risks, Alan, are also very specific to each industry. So, in the motor manufacturing industry, if motor manufacturing does not adapt to the export market requirement for electric vehicles, it's going to go out of business and won't be able to sustain employment in South Africa at the rate that it does right now, because the markets that it serves are largely the European markets that are introducing electric vehicle incentives, and the whole, there's a big tipping point of how that transition happens. So the transitions that happen in other countries actually very directly affect the well-being of people on the ground. And so it's a huge risk, and that risk has to be managed both, between government and the private sector. I mean, industrial-wise, our industries are highly dependent on coal-generated electricity. So steel exports to a market in Europe that is, is imposing restrictions on the carbon footprint of your production system, they're going to be heavily impacted. And that goes for all of our heavy industry, which is highly dependent on the coal-generated electricity. So it's very important that the entire system changes in order for those businesses to survive. And I could go on, but every industry is really facing significant transition risks that have to be managed, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you. And I think it's really critical, I think, mentioning the external influences, whether it's moved to EVs. I think carbon border adjustment mechanisms are starting to gather force, and the implications to the sustainability of businesses, but that knock-on effect on livelihoods.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the space, right? And I think a just transition really needs to ensure that livelihoods are improved and sustained. But Shamila, maybe, I think, picking up on Sue's points and from your perspective, you can share your thoughts.
Sue's outlined all the risks. Can I just take the rest?
Well, how about within a risk, there's also opportunity, right? So maybe the bright side.
No, certainly. So I think just firstly to expand a little further on the risk side, and for business in particular, one of the other risks, of course, and has a chapter within the JET implementation plan or the investment plan, is the issue of the skills gap. Because as we're seeing the businesses need to transition, of course, there are new skills that need to come online. And this week, in fact, I was listening to the CEO, the founder of LinkedIn. Of course, it's that wonderful platform, but who has amazing, incredible data insights. And what he said was that they were tracking the new jobs, sort of the green jobs that you're finding advertised. And so that's exponentially doing this. But what they're already finding is the match in terms of skills is doing this. So there's a gap already being created just now globally from the platform and what they do. So that's an interesting data point, I think, to supplement what we intuitively feel already. And so the skills gap is one that is going to be a big one that we need to fill, and we need to be able to be forward thinking on that. And it's a little bit difficult because it's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation right now, where you're thinking, well, unless we've properly identified and committed to the sectors that are going to be in the green industrialization, then how do we actually understand what is the skills that are required? But I think there are some safe bets we can take anyway, because the transition, particularly the energy transition, is happening anyway. If we just look at what's happened in relation, post the lifting of the self-generation cap in South Africa, we've seen more solar come onto the grid in that year and a bit than we did in the previous 10 years put together. And so that already tells you that that is happening. And people are doing that because, well, of course, firstly, it's an energy security issue. And, we mustn't forget that energy security is very closely aligned to national security. And so once that's happening already tells you that it needs to happen, and it's going to continue as we just see, the economics of moving to renewables make a lot more sense. And so what would really help, I think, to minimize some of the risk and the more haphazard nature to a more kind of, orderly transition would be the enabling regulation certainty, I think, at the framework at a strategic level as a country. would make a big difference from that, because it enables then a far more orderly thing. The other risk, of course, apart from the ones that have been clearly outlined economically, particularly in different sectors, is going to be if we don't transition quickly enough, it's going to be just the other part of the economic cost is the investment risk. And I'm talking about not investment risk at necessarily just the country level. I'm talking about each and every one of our pension funds. So there was work done about a year and a half, 2 years ago, that was looking at the impact on the market. For my sins, I worked in financial services, and I was at the JSE for a whole of 16 years. And what I did is looked at potentially the impact of stranded assets on what that means then for pension fund investments going into the future. And dependent on whether the transition was orderly or disorderly, the magnitude of the loss in the value long-term of that investment was quite substantial. So our pension funds, each of us sitting in that room, is directly linked to what happens on that market and the risk embedded in those assets, particularly stranded assets and those companies that might be able to move fast enough. So those are some of the other risks. I said she'd done all the risks, but I just realized there were some of those that could be relevant as well. And then those are those. And then, of course, from there, the knock-on impact on people is massive. The risk is, firstly, that people don't understand and then are just naturally resistant, which is understandable. But the other risk is that we don't adequately know exactly what that translates into down the line, and that's, I think, the pieces of work we're doing. Obviously, work happening in Mpumalanga, which is immediately in the energy sector at risk, but then concomitantly, the other sectors are the ones we need to look at. And I wish that everybody was here, and if I encourage you later on, if you can, to watch the video that is playing about this tapestry. So those of you who were here when the president visited the other day, this tells our story better than we ever could. It actually comes from a community in Hamburg, in the Eastern Cape, which is, it is the Eastern Cape, right? It's Eastern Cape, yeah. I got that right. Please don't let me confuse my provinces. My son would be mortified that his mother didn't know. But it was in Hamburg, that's right. And it was actually from an adaptation project with WWF. And this has then been produced, a project in the community that tells the story of what the community was feeling. So when we're talking about human rights, when we're talking about people in communities, this is a depiction of that. And effectively says what they'd been feeling and experiencing without attributing that or having the language to say this is a consequence of climate change. And this is the transition that the community is saying they would like to see. They're talking about already the impact that they can't get fish in their rivers, which that community is dependent on. They're talking about the impacts of pollution, the impacts of joblessness, of the triple issue that we have of poverty, inequality, and unemployment, all of that within this. And then the expectation that hopefully the transition is going to help bridge many of those. And it's a big weight to place on one bridge of trying to bank everything we need to solve as a country, on that. But this is a community saying, we need that. We're hoping it will happen.
Thank you. And I think it's really to take that, to zoom in on the risks, but you've got to zoom out because I think that the dominoes of impacts is absolutely critical to be aware of. And I think we tend to focus on the immediate, more tangible risks. So let's take Mpumalanga, I think it's ground zero, but there are multiple transitions underway, each which needed planning. And I think that area around policy certainty, because I think otherwise there's analysis paralysis, I think waiting and missed opportunities. So I think, thank you for that. So Claude, I think we've spoken about sort of risks to companies, the economy, and looking at risks to communities and people. So just your reflections, and I think that maybe also just to pull out this idea that where does the obligation lie, right? And how do you instill the obligation and then, and we will speak to it, start looking towards accountability. I think that voluntary nature, the vision is great, but in practice, we do have to start thinking about how we keep it moving in practice.
Thank you, Alan. I'm very quite impressed that they spoke like civil society. So they've done my job. I don't know what I'm going to say because this is the things I should have said. But on a more serious note, I think there's a much bigger risk that we need to seriously consider. There is an assumption when we are talking about just energy transition, which suggests that in the high carbon economy, there was justice. We have never had justice. And the question for me is, what makes us believe that as we transit, we are going to achieve justice? What indicators are there? What characteristics are emerging that suggest that we'll achieve justice? Or it's just a rhetoric because you just want to come here and meet and come up with the big words when we know that we are not going to achieve it? Because this picture that has just been painted has existed for so many years. And business has been there. Since 1994, South Africa has faced so many challenges. And one of the questions always been raised is business coming to the party? Why are we having so much resources, the most advanced economy on the continent, but facing these serious challenges of poverty, unemployment, and inequality? Why are we failing to achieve justice? Now, how are we going to achieve justice simply because we are transiting to a new type of energy? So for me, that's an important question. And the second point is that, can business provide us an opportunity to create justice? Now, you look around the world, there's never been business driving justice. Business is about profit. Business is about creating wealth for the shareholders. How do we provide? That's, for me, a big risk if we want to provide space for private sector to lead a just transition in a mix of poverty. And we need to reflect properly. And you are saying whose responsibility it is. My sense is that public good, if justice is a good, it should be a public good. And it has to be driven by the state. The state has to play a more leading role to ensure that we meet the just. We are working in Carolina, in Mpumalanga, surrounded by more than 15 coal mines. When we talk to the people in Carolina, we are training women to be able to speak for themselves, for their communities. Women whose husband work in the mine or husband are unemployed. And when we call for meetings, the mining companies don't come. They don't show up. Either they are afraid of the commitment that they have to make to resolve some of the serious injustices, or they simply think they are not involved. And the risk, maybe the third one, Alan, is the gap between, how do you bridge the gap between state, private sector, and people? And for me, that is an important one, because what we see emerging is that people, one, they don't have the correct information. Secondly, they don't know which door to go and knock when they face problems. Third, the information, when I know the Presidential Commission, when they go around to communicate with people, we found that there's a big gap. The people are spoken to not on an organized base, where people come organized with issues identified and position taken. So you go in a community, you communicate with people. People are coming with different issues, individually or... So there's a bit of that risk that the state is not properly engaging. And when you don't create ownership in the process, you don't provide an opportunity for that just to happen. So that's the last point I want to make is I think there is a risk to continue with the same economic model. The neo-economic liberal model has created injustices. At the global level, I think there must be an effort to create an economic model that produces global justice. But you see, the responsibility then, Alan, is not in this room. The responsibility becomes at the global level. Are the people who control this big institution prepared to come to the party and say the model we've used for centuries has not worked? Not just for the individual people I'm talking in Carolina, but for a continent like the African continent. The African continent is going to provide some of the critical minerals needed to successfully implement the just transition or the energy transition. But are we going to continue with a system where these resources are simply pillaged, where the people owners of these resources are left in poverty? Responsibility, to your question is at all different levels, at the global, at the regional level, at state level, but at private sector level. But also you find that these communities are not cohesive. There is a responsibility to try and create society that are cohesion, that there is cohesion. A society where you minimize conflict over resources. I get a sense when I came here and talking to people, the level of cohesion here is amazing. And this country, most of the things are driven by the state to provide services and so on. It's not the private sector. It's the state that ensures that things are distributed in a fair way. So I'll rest it there.
Thank you. And I think that's a challenge, is that if we couldn't get justice right in round one, I think the challenge to get it right in round two, but maybe this speaks to the conversation about what you mentioned, Shamila, is that there's a lot of pressure on the transition to address a lot of the structural, systemic issues in the system itself. And I think we're seeing these conversations emerging in conversations around the global financial architecture. I think there is a momentum coming around because this knock-on effect, how economies work and interact with the global system are relevant. But I think it really manifests itself in the community. And I'm just going to take that piece where you said bridging the gap, and perhaps how state, civil society, communities, and government interact. It's not working, and maybe the conversation isn't happening in the right way. And once again, saying, is it, how do you unlock the potential in the vision for a just transition to rethink the conversations? Because I think, and I think we'll speak to different standards, South Africa on paper is far more advanced than most countries. Mining has social and labor plans. The reprogram built in a lot of social safeguards. The constitution more broadly is horizontally and vertically applicable. There is an obligation. How that comes to life, I think, is what we will see policy certainty for as well in terms of the different types of interventions. But maybe I think let's get a bit more focus on the JET-P and what's happening in the country at the moment. And Sue, I'm going to ask you maybe just to reflect over the last 2 years from the JET investment plan to the soon-to-be launched implementation plan. How has the JET implementation unit, and maybe just for those that don't know, maybe a brief mandate on what the implementation unit is doing, and how it seeks to address the issue of these issues we're discussing, but also the role of the private sector. I said the transition will not happen without the private sector. And yeah, some thoughts and reflections there. Thank you.
Sure. Well, just a little bit of context. I think where the work started was with the Presidential Climate Commission developing the framework for a just transition in South Africa. And that was a widely consultative process to understand, what constitutes justice? What will be the principles that we need to keep in mind constantly as we get into practical planning? We just need to guide us the whole way. And that framework was adopted in 2022, and it really speaks to 3 core principles, and that is that the transition will not be just if it isn't restorative, if it isn't procedurally just, and it doesn't distribute. It's not distributive. So I think, those are big concepts, and yet they apply in a very practical way. And so when we started working on the investment plan, it was on the one hand quite a technical exercise of saying what levels of investment do we need in the South African economy to transition the energy system in order to meet the climate emission reduction targets that our country has committed to globally under the UNFCCC. So that nationally determined contribution target range was the focus of the technical work. What scale of investment is going to be needed. Now, part of that analysis was on the scale of investment needed in infrastructure. So renewable energy, transmission grid, distribution grid, electric vehicles, green hydrogen, and in a way that can be done through engineering, and that's fine. But the much more complex thing was to understand what the justice component would involve. What kind of level of investment are we looking at? And we really looked at economic diversification, and how do we create new opportunities for employment and livelihoods in areas that are completely dependent on the coal value chain in particular. And we honed in on Mpumalanga, which is the province which is largely dependent on coal, and Carolina, as that Clarence has mentioned, is in Mpumalanga, and is as surrounded by coal mining, and living in terrible air quality conditions. Poverty is extremely rife in many of our communities in the region. Unemployment is very high. And so we had to say, well, what are the potential industries that could develop, that could be opportunities for people's livelihoods going forward? And working through a number of organizations that are very familiar with the conditions in those regions, it was possible to identify where those opportunities lie. Now, they're not at a scale that industry employs. So we're looking at agriculture, we're looking at forestry, we're looking at tourism, and potentially the renewable energy value chain. And hopefully, as the battery industry starts to develop, there would be opportunities to develop battery industrial businesses in that region. But I think when we looked at the just component, we said, actually, it's going to require bespoke planning by people themselves in the local areas as to identify what their opportunities are. So people taking control over the determination of their futures. And if the Just Transition Investment Plan doesn't provide resources for that, then we're not going to achieve what needs to be achieved. So a lot of work has to go into this community level, careful, enabling planning that allows people to take charge of their own lives. And we have a situation, I think, where there's so much dependency on grants, on formal jobs, and we need to shift to entrepreneurial mindsets about where the gaps are, what could we be doing. And then our resources need to enable people and support people to take those opportunities. So when we built out the investment plan, we identified that quite a large chunk is going to need to be in the form of grants that are going to support people to take those early investments in new employment opportunities. And they can't do it purely off the back of debt. They're going to have to be given support to take those early risk steps. So we budgeted for that. And when we set out the 1.5 trillion investment plan, it was both the big infrastructure and this community level employment opportunity, entrepreneurial, economic diversification work that needs to be done. And it's much more difficult than the big infrastructure investments. It's much more painstaking and patient, and it requires really holding hands with people and finding a route forward. And we don't only insist that government does that, but we insist that the private sector does that as well. And we insist that civil society organizations play their role in helping communities to make those transitions. And it's going to be a long and slow process, but that's where we need a lot of grant support. And it's really interesting because when we looked at the 1.5 trillion scale of need, we identified that at least a third of that could come from private investment, and particularly in renewable energy, in electric vehicles, in green hydrogen, and distribution systems and transmission systems. And in speaking to the private sector, the asset managers, the banks, there's plenty of private capital just waiting for projects to roll. And all of them have come to our engagement sessions and said, we're with you. We absolutely support this transition. Where's the project pipeline? So there's a huge pressure, I think, on government to unlock the regulatory environment and provide for that pipeline. But the other interesting thing that we identified is that about 45 billion rand a year is spent on corporate social investment in South Africa, on ESD projects. And that's a commitment that the private sector already has. Now, we want to know whether there are ways of channeling that finance to the just energy transition and matching that finance with international grants, with philanthropic contributions, and being able to leverage that resource in order to attract different forms of finance in debt and other things, and equity. But if we can really operationalize what we have on the table in the form of grants and work with the private sector to say, you have corporate social investment money that is committed in the province of Mpumalanga. How do we then rally that to leverage on the other resources that are coming in? And I think that's the real opportunity that we have. So just lastly, one of the things that we've done in the implementation plan is to set up a grants register, which is on the President's website, on the State of the Nation website, and we have published all the grants that have been committed by the international community to the just transition, and we've published it not just in a PDF format, but in Excel spreadsheet, so that you can analyze where the money is going. And you can see at the moment the money is going into technical assistance and capacity building and intermediaries and, the normal one-on-one grant allocations. A lot of good work. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the work that's being done. But what we're saying is, let's see if we can't leverage that funding better and see if we can match it with corporate social investment funding, if we can match it with debt financing. And so we are setting up what we're calling a funding platform, which will be a matchmaker. It's not a fund, but a matchmaker between the providers of grant funding and project originators who have really good ideas and initiatives that could actually work in the communities where they're needed. And we are going to identify where it's possible to match the project with the grants and where it's possible to leverage debt as well. So if it's an entrepreneurial business that is developing, it's going to need some grant support in the beginning, but then it can carry debt on a viable opportunity. So we think it's an exciting way forward, and we're going to invite the private sector to register their CSI facilities with this platform, so that those facilities that are being earmarked for the energy transition can also become part of this pool of potential capital that can be deployed to community investment. I'll stop there.
No, thank you. And I think sort of looking at how you also create the space and the pathways for private sector, and I think this idea of pipeline is so critical.
Yeah.
And to what extent is it unwillingness versus saying is that maybe there is the infrastructure or what does one invest in, what are the projects? And I think I will come back to you in a bit in terms of how the PMU, given its mandate and the vision for a just transition, is defining the transactions that would be eligible to be put on that register, right? Because I think there's a need for guidance in terms of saying as well, what is a just transition transaction? How do we avoid the risk of transition washing? I think it's quite real in terms of how you capture that. But maybe before we get to that, I'm come back to you, Shamila, and maybe a bit of work on NBI and its work in engaging the private sector on the JET-P, but also more broadly on how the NBI, through its membership, works on social standards within the private sector. And are there any trends or emerging in terms of the reaction of the private sector to the JET-P and the compatibility with current practices versus this new, big, very ambitious vision?
Sure. And so I think in relation to the private sector sort of response on the JET-P, Sue's covered quite a bit of that already, so let me not cover that ground again. I think what's also useful to know is that our work generally on transition predates the JET-P. And so if you look back over 3 years, the NBI, together with business, civil society, and government, did the Just Transition Pathways work. And what was that? That was effectively a step that said, is net zero by 2050 possible for our economy? And if it's possible, what might that look like? And so that piece of work was an extensive piece of work, 400 stakeholders, I don't know how many hundred hours worth of work going into that. And we partnered with BCG and used the Plexus model, which is one that underpins ESCOM, to be able to understand exactly for our economy what that might look like. And that's freely available on our website as a resource if anybody wants to look at that. And the engagement on that, and of course we also then worked with 30 CEO champions behind that work, and those engagements happened every few weeks. I remember sitting in those meetings on the other side of the fence as part of the advisory committee advising my own CEO, who was then the champion as well, which engaged at every stage is what that meant. And then a lot of engagement with civil society, like we said, and government bringing on board. And what the work did then was produce the overarching sort of pathway, and which not only identified that net zero by 2050 was possible, but that if done correctly with the correct enabling environment, it was also net jobs positive. And it's an important place to stop on, because when we're looking at the just transition now, of course, and rightfully so, the focus is on the job losses in the value chain in terms of the core value chain. And that is critical, because with the dependency ratio of anything between 1:5 and 1:10 on every job, any loss is a serious concern. And when we're sitting here talking about human rights, what is that impact? But the other side is that even prior to COVID, our economy was already struggling, and we were in desperate need of a shift. And so the opportunity here potentially is that where we sit is that chance to actually reorientate our economy to be future fit and globally competitive, and actually in many instances even bring down the costs, for example, in energy, and make energy more accessible. Because things like solar, for example, lend themselves to microgrids, and you can do that and make that more accessible. So there are a number of areas where that touches on, but going back quickly to the pathways. So what we also did was produce a series of sectoral decarbonization pathways, and that covered all the major sectors in the economy, and each of them has a set of recommendations as to what the key things would be to be able to enable that. And whilst I would love for that to have been the contribution to the strategy for the country, but what it's also done is that enabled companies to use that already as a blueprint. So even in the absence of anything more enabling above that, that's given a far more clear map as to these are the things you can do in your industry already. And so that piece of work has been helpful. What that also did was allow for a level of political cover for the government to go to COP26 with enhanced NDCs. On the back of the enhanced NDCs, we landed that 8.5 billion first offering for the JET-P, or into the JET-P, should I say. And so that was the engagement piece that actually predated the investment plan. And so I think that is important to know, that some of that had directly contributed, because that could already identify where some of the key sectors were that an investment plan could focus on and that could win. And I think that's been helpful from that regard. So we've continued with that now in a different form, taken a small breather, but the focus going into that is definitely going to be on skills. And then, of course, at a more granular level now, how does one operationalize, or at sectoral level, find those pieces that we can already get that collective action for and start engaging on. So those are the areas there, and that I think are from how we've seen that play out, and where we can see the direct contribution on the ground level, collective action and engagement that we can do with the private sector. Then to answer your question on the standards and the frameworks and the social elements. So within the NBI, I think what we're starting to do is to really try to integrate across all the work that we do. So we have, for example, a social transformation focus in one of our units, and that's really about looking at those elements of social transformation. Gender has been a large focus of that, and then a number of other elements within that, including things like anti-corruption. And that might not be an immediate connect, but it is a big connect when you're talking about social justice. And so those are the areas that we're now doing cross-cutting across our work, and we're trying to integrate there. That work, because it's directly done with corporates, helps companies to engage. It helps them with tools to be able to actually assess their own inclusion practices. And so that's piece that we're working with already. For example, now when we'll talk about the skills project in one of the other sessions in the week, and you'll see that there's a cross-cutting element now. We're integrating, we're saying you can't see these things as separate issues. How can we bring together the frameworks we've already developed to do that? Then lastly, on the integration, and I have to comment then more broadly on the ESG standards and frameworks that companies are already looking at. And again, from my previous role, work directly with that. ESG standards and frameworks is very much the day job of a sustainability officer. And how do you bring those elements in? So the sustainability frameworks already have a big focus on the S element. What it also does do, though, is I ever tell you that those things are generic, but there is a big push on companies to contextualize those. And so context matters. If there's anything one takes away from sustainability and approaches generally, is that context matters. And then that is incumbent on the company to understand the context in which they operate. You cannot look at South Africa and not have the just element of the transition as part of your context when you're defining and explaining how you approach the S elements in your sustainability disclosures. And so having a framework like the ones that bring in restorative, distributive, procedural justice are going to be helpful in getting companies to contextualize that specifically here. So those frameworks can then, I think it's an explicit link that needs to be made. But for me, is a more obvious one, is that that's an area where you do that as well. What it also does is help companies who are assessed on these ESG ratings and things like that to be able to explain to international investors, or whoever it is that is accessing that data firstly, and secondly, using that to assess a company's investment viability, or just generally its engagement with its stakeholders, is that what does this mean in your context? If you're looking at what sustainability means and what justice means in South Africa and what justice means in Germany, very different dimensions that one needs to focus on. And so this is where I think these frameworks are hugely helpful. The conversation absolutely has to happen at a more granular level to be able to do that, because what it also does is bring the private sector in to help explain our context to international investors. That is solely our responsibility. So when you're being assessed, and you might not meet the same indicator that somebody puts into a framework, you need to be able to explain why it looks the way it does, and why, for example, even your net zero trajectory might not be the same as a company in Europe. It's not that I don't want to do it, but my transition is different. And so those are where I think the standards and the frameworks will need a lot more deeper engagement with companies, but is a massive opportunity collectively for us to be able to explain that and to carry through the same narrative, be it in our ESG frameworks, be it in JETP, whatever the case is, and to understand these are not different things. They are deeply connected.
Thank you. And I think what came out clear there is context, context, context. Whether at a national or a country level, whether at a sub-national level, whether at a sector level, whether at a community level. I think this idea that the practical and substantive content to the frameworks that on paper will always look good will come down to devising the responses that are as specific and contextually relevant to where we're trying to achieve that impact.
Alan, can I just add one point? And this is very critical for particularly corporate sector now. One of the big trends in sustainability is greenwashing and greenhushing. And very quickly, if you're not able to explain context, it becomes evident that it's not sincere content and you paid somebody to do the marketing spiel for you.
Yeah.
And so it is, I would say, a mitigation factor against greenwashing and greenhushing risk.
Yeah. And I think what's emerging now, I think, even though it hasn't been a question, we're saying, everyone says, well, what is the just transition? What makes it just? And I think we're seeing a distinction on the process and the procedural elements, and I think the participation and engagement in just elements. But we've also been touching on outcomes. I think livelihoods has come out across a lot in job creation and mitigating job loss. But you also mentioned earlier access to energy, and I think these are the features of a transition will not be just if we aren't seeing some of these elements. And I think that's really useful, because I think we do risk in these conversations 2 years on to start talking in the generic, right? Leave no one behind. I think these are all messages we 100% agree with. But I think it's slowly getting very, very specific as I think the money is getting closer to that deployment. So, Claude, I'm going to turn to you. I think you're hearing some of the intentions and some of the plans and the approach to the just transition. And from the perspective of yourself and given the work you're doing with communities, sort of, one, maybe just a reflection on what's been said so far based on the work with communities. But what would opportunities be? I think the transition is temporal. I think you have to measure impact at different stages. This is a 20, 30-year endeavor. What we need in year 1 to 3 is going to be very different from year 3 to 7. And perhaps at the moment, while we're looking at state capability and capacity and the ability to implement a transition, we are more procedurally focused. And maybe just a reflection in terms of what do we need now, and as we look forward, how engagement and accountability will evolve.
No, thank you. I think there is need to create hope. I know hope is not policy, but we need to. There is too much stress on communities, on people, just to go about making a living in South Africa.
Yeah.
So the immediate, I think, intervention, and I'm very happy to show that they've laid out the structure, the policies, and so on. And private sector business is also coming to the party, identifying itself as a key player to ensure that they provide the resources that are needed to do what needs to be done. But the hope I'm talking about is people to start be convinced that the state, the private sector, they are working to take us out of this quagmire of poverty. And for me, that's an important one. And that can only be done by a very effective communication. And when we hear the private sector, we hear the government, it seems there is a gap between pronouncement, policies, and implementation. We need to close that gap. So going to the people in a more organized, effective way. And we need to find what does effective mean when you go to a community in Caroline, where we are working with women. You need to understand what effective mean when you go to Sikukunya, where we are also working with women, dealing with mining companies, which need to decarbonize, but also which needs to implement the ESG, the CSR effectively. Because as we bring the CSR, ESG into the entire frame of energy transition, how do we make them effective? Because they've not been effective. When you go across South Africa where mining, these critical minerals are extracted, that's where you find the poorest communities. It means those CSR, ESGs that these mining companies have been implementing have not been effective. So we need to rethink, and I'm happy that they want to align them to the energy transition, not as access to energy, but as a total transformation of the economic system in South Africa. And I think that is important. Now, my sense is that then for us to reach there, you need transparency and accountability. Transparency is really to be able to provide information in a transparent way. I'm happy that everything now has been put online, how much money is coming in, where it's going to be used. But people we are talking about don't have access to that online platform. How do we package that information that reaches those people in their very easy to access information, in their language, at a different level? For me, that's an important one. That's where you start building hope, you start building trust between the different stakeholders. And my sense is that we need to start talking to the very low level. From schools, we need to start educating people about these things. It seems we are talking at the very high level, where we engage the unemployed, but I think we need to be very structured, take this conversation into schools, start educating at a very low level, because people then start. So that's accountability, is to provide information at the right time when people can use it. You can't come today, you're telling people the information they should have had 6 months ago. There's no need for it. So that's one. Secondly, is that what my panelists have said, participation. Community participation, informed participation. But that participation is not to bring people and talk to them. You need to bring people who are at very least capable of engaging the issues and articulating them at the level that they are able to convince you otherwise. Not simply your argument become the dominant. That's the problem. So how do we ensure that those communities are built at the level where they can engage the state, they can engage private sector? That, look, the model we are talking about for us is not agriculture here. We don't think it's that. We've consulted ourselves and we've come to that what we need is a different type. How do you help those communities then to start engaging themselves at that level, to find their own way of getting out of poverty? Not a top-down, but we need a bottom-up economic development model. So I think gender becomes very important. And we've seen that in most conversation, women and girls tend to be excluded. And this is not just in South Africa, but across our continent. We need to be very deliberate to position. When you, in fact, to go to these mining communities, because you are mostly invest into good governance on using our minerals across the continent, you find that women pick up the load of supporting families. They work very hard. How do we ensure that they become a key voice in this conversation? And I think that's a deliberate decision that anyone who wants to go and engage must ensure that the women in that community are represented. And are represented not at a level just of physical presence, but capable voice that can. So, but then I agree, context matters. And that context becomes important when what we are discussing, the solution we want to find, is based on an assessment driven by community data. You can't then go to a community, you have not done an analysis in terms of the real data around the geography, the resources, the people. So you need to have done data analysis for you to be able to provide that for the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which is driven. In fact, I want to say the energy Just Energy Transition Partnership cannot be South Africa and the rest of the world or the people who are giving money. It has first and foremost be a partnership between government and the people of South Africa. The just needs to start at that level. Then together the state, the people, the private sector, then can engage the global. So my sense is that partnership, so here we've got two concepts, the just and the partnership. I want to make an argument that partnership must be first and foremost local, national, then engage with the rest of the world together. And for me, that's very important. Now, the issue of elevating justice, especially the point that has been made about corporate, be able to embrace in their work justice. But corporate cannot embrace that simply by articulating it in their responsibility, sustainability reports. It has to be reflected in the company itself. How much resources the company is investing within the company itself in terms of sustainability work, in terms of justice. How do you count that? How do you look into that? You look at the people that are put in that section to deal with that, at how level of the company justice is elevated, what type of skills are being put in to deal with this in terms of really thinking and driving it as a serious section and department of the company. Not as by the way, and then look at the resources that has been put in that. Is it a priority for the company? And how do you see that this is a priority? You see it in the size, the skills, the importance, the resources that are being put in. Because as they say, Sue said, it's very complex. You need capacity to, and that is not just for private sector, but the state also. Is the state investing sufficiently to achieve the process first, where we are, to achieve that hope, to organize communities and so forth and so on? Thank you.
Thank you, Claude. And I think what was coming clearly is we're all saying the same thing, right? And I think it's the how this is being done, and issues around participation, transparency. Is it participation, for it to be meaningful, is a very different type of participation. I think transparency, what information, and recognizing the inherent inequalities and power dynamics that can exist in these spaces. So I think this is something really quite interesting to follow on. And what I'm going to do, I have a couple more questions, and I think to start talking about this accountability process output, but I'd like to, we've been speaking a lot up front here, and whether or not there are any questions or reflect, even before. It's like you pushed the buzzer. Well, the floor is now open, and I'll start over here. If you could introduce yourself, and then Ayanda, I know you, and Joanna.
Thank you. Sorry for being so keen. Annika Brouwer from 91 Asset Management. We engage with our portfolio companies on this constantly, and we have our own way of assessing the just inclusion within corporates' transition plans. And I'm talking specifically about your energy companies, your local mining companies, the companies where the value chains directly impact and can influence this. Two things that were said at the beginning. One was on local communities are having dialogues where mining, not necessarily mining, but companies are not necessarily participating. And the second thing was on that marketing piece that you said, you have these beautiful marketing plans, but it's about implementation. Now, as a shareholder in companies, you're given publicly available information, and it is your job to engage on that information. And we can only engage, we can only ask so many questions and understand really on the ground, what does it mean to have a just transition plan? And it strikes me that companies not showing up to the dialogues themselves is probably evidence of that plan not being implemented. How can you understand the needs of the communities if you're not engaging directly with the communities themselves? So the question is, how do we as shareholders help bridge that gap between that beautiful plan that we get presented to on a PowerPoint presentation and them showing up at the community dialogue?
Maybe Claude can venture an answer. I mean, for me, the simple one is that they need to provide evidence, right? This is when I went, this is what it is, and that a shareholder could ask for that information as evidence that that's happened. Because that's where it comes down to, if you look at the JSE Sustainability Disclosure Guidance, the initial elements of justice were actually incorporated in there. I think it's probably one of the first in the world to do something like that, but it specifically asks, have you engaged with your stakeholders? What is the evidence of how have you done that? And so those things would be, I think, the next step, Annika, is to say, where's the evidence?
Great. Ayanda? Or is anyone else who'd like maybe to respond to that question on the panel?
Yeah, maybe. No, look, I think it's an important question. We work with companies. I think they struggle to find an effective way to engage with communities. You see, sometimes we think when we come together like this and we talk to each other, we've engaged, simply because communities have come up and we saw them. We are in the same room, yeah. No, in fact, I was called by a very important big company, mining company, and asked me to say, can you tell us how we can engage effectively with a community? This company has been there for decades, and it's an old mining company. And they call all their managers just to say, how do we engage with communities? It seems everything we do, the community is rejecting us. We've done so much, that's what they say, but the community is not convinced, and we are worried. So that's the point, that you will think we are engaging, but the community is not convinced, does not follow. You come, you invest, maybe you build a school, but the community is still rejecting you. So my sense is that they just have to provide an opportunity to community to tell you, this is what we think you should do, and this is the way you should engage with us. And for the community to be able to tell you that, this community must be given an opportunity to organize. It's not a cohesive community. There are tensions, there are divisions, there are interests. Now it's for you to say, how do we capacitate this community to break those barriers? And it's a difficult work. That's why I'm saying you need to see in a company how interested this company is in helping this community. And that comes with the entire spectrum of things that needs to be done.
Thank you.
I do think that we need to think about ways in which companies can enable people to take agency themselves. And it's not just a matter of having a meeting and saying, oh, you need a school. It's a matter of rebuilding, because people have lost that agency. Poverty does terrible things. Inequality, people are broken, their lives are hard just to survive. And so I think a lot more emphasis has to be placed on not just building the school, but building the organizations that can take control over decision making and allow people to make their own decisions about their own futures. And I think that's a mind shift. And I wonder about the role of the shareholder, because often, the traditional is the shareholder says to the company, give me evidence of what you've done. But maybe the shareholder has to take an additional step and do a dipstick into some of these communities and understand what's really going on, and then be able to feed that back to the company. Because I know it's extra, it's not what shareholders normally do, but I wonder if shareholders shouldn't go a step further. Yeah.
Can I just add to that? I think that the whole notion of stakeholder primacy in itself is being re-looked at. If we look at just where we're looking at the trends in responsible investment and all of that. So Sue's point, I think, is absolutely brilliant. And it's one of those in that reconceptualization of what we need to start thinking about differently in relation to investment is potentially then, do we go a level deeper than we have on engagement? Because you've got an asset manager, but an asset manager is acting on behalf of asset owners,
Exactly. Yeah.
and the asset owner is directly vested in what happens in that community, because you're investing on behalf of that pension, and that pension needs to buy a decent place in which to retire, not just the 10% returns year on year, but a society that is worth, retiring into, in relation to whether am I going to use that fantastic growth in my millions of rands to now pay 50% of that towards water security, just physical security, maybe even energy security. What kind of did we build with that money? So perhaps there's a different dimension to engagement than the traditional mechanisms we've deployed.
And I think that notion of participate and how you create the forms for participation. I said South African law, I'm putting my lawyer hat on, creates numerous forums, but the way it's working is that there's an inherent inequity if you're not equipping the community to engage
Yes.
with a mining company or another company who comes with an army of lawyers and research. So there's a number of ways to change the way you're engaging. And I think, and maybe to look to other spaces. So the REAP program, community ownership, talk about shareholding. There's also shareholding options where there's more skin in the game already around these issues, purely beyond building a school. So I think this is something which hopefully can be explored, because there must be models where it's worked, because also failure to get that right, you start seeing delays, and there is also an economic cost to not getting the participation, either legally but also just in terms of the operation of the business in that community. So I think a really good point that you're thinking about here. Ayanda.
Hello, okay, this is on. Hello everyone, Ayanda from the Ford Foundation. I have a question for Claude and Shamila, and either of you can really answer. But it's really about civil society. And civil society in South Africa, in its relationship with the government, has really been seen in the most recent days as hostile. And there's been a lack of trust between civil society and government. And so basically my question is, does the private sector on its own, outside of the government, still believe in the capacity and responsibility of civil society to hold government accountable, as transparency and accountability remain the core of the transition? That's my question. Thank you.
Good, I'm happy for you to take that first.
Yeah, no.
Civil society holding
That's a difficult question. I think it's true that we've seen that animosity. And it's quite sad that it's the ANC government that will be having that attitude towards civil society. One would have expected that it's a government that will continue to strengthen and believe in civil society, but because it has worked through the struggle with civil society. So that's a sad one, and I think we need to fix that to ensure that there is an esteemed relation between government and civil society. But when it comes to the energy transition, that it has emerged from the discourse around coal. Should we abandon coal, or should coal continue to be part of the energy mix? And I think we've seen a strong voice from civil society that advocates for abandoning coal and investing too quickly into the green energy. So I think, again, we are coming back to dialogue. My sense is that there isn't a platform currently where this thing is seriously engaged, where civil society, government, and private sector come and sit as a society, because South Africa's miracle has been built around dialogue. How can we come together to discuss if we can't abandon coal now, what is the plan that we have in place? So that you convince those civil society that think that we need to abandon now and invest massively in green energy to understand your point. That we are not saying we are not abandoning coal, but we can't just drop it now. There is a process we are going to follow, and that's a dialogue that needs to happen. And my sense, I might be wrong, that there isn't a really organized platform. Alan, I think you, African Climate Foundation, but I haven't seen it, where the issue of coal energy transition, private sector, civil society. You see, when you talk about civil society, you are talking also about community organized voices. You are talking about civil society that is on both sides. Those are for, those are against, and those are in the middle. Come have that conversation. I think you'll start to build that trust. And I think there's we've lost that trust. And my sense is that this issue of, because the issue of coal has also divided government and parties within. There are different groups. It's not an homogeneous position, even within government, even within the ruling party around coal. So it just, for me, I think maybe the private sector can help rebuild that space for dialogue where we can differ to agree, differ, and come up with a position that for South Africa, and that's the position we need to communicate to the world, that as a country, as a society, this is what our path to energy transition. And if you've got civil society supporting you, you've got private sector, you've got communities, who else will come and pressure you to do what your people say you should not be doing? So my sense is that we need a platform for serious dialogue to rebuild that trust between government and civil society.
Thank you.
So the trust element was the bottom line. I would have, exactly that is the platforms where the engagement can happen to rebuild the trust. The Edelman Trust Barometer is a study that comes out every year and effectively measures the level of trust between civil society and each of government, business, NGOs, and the media. And the polarization in trust, particularly between civil society and government, has grown exponentially. Interestingly, has reduced between civil society and business. So increasingly you're seeing this push for business to actually stand up and take leadership even in areas that they traditionally are not, usually being taken leadership in and is sitting as a remit of the government. So I think that's a very interesting view on what has happened in that trust relationship. But I think completely speaks to Claude's point is that if we want to rebuild that, and we know, I know it's cliched now because it's so often said, is that if we want to go fast, if we want to go far, we go together. If we want to go fast, we go alone. And there's not going to be a transition if we don't go together.
Yeah.
And so this is where the trust element, I think, has to be rebuilt. And so those platforms for the engagement are going to be critical. But there is an element of speed that is required because there's a lot at stake economically which directly impacts livelihoods if we don't do the transition.
So I think that public-private philanthropic partnership is
Absolutely.
really emerging as something that and the resources. Also, I think recognizing that engagement takes resources. A meaningful participation isn't just something that just happens by having a meeting in a room. So that's a really nice piece coming out. I know. Yeah, over to you.
John Morris. Is it on? Yeah,
Yes.
John Morrison, HRB. I'm going to say something a bit controversial, if that's okay, and see if it sort of gets some enlightenment. This afternoon, we have ministers from all over the world in a ministerial talking about just transition, which is good. But in most countries around the world, governments don't use the language of just transition domestically. South Africa's an exception there. But in global north and global south, even governments that are very much, I would say, at the front of the just transition agenda here are not using it domestically perhaps because of the expectations that rise or the perceptions of just. But when they do use the word just, they don't mean justice. Just in just transition terms here is through the lens of the ILO, largely around workplace rights, labour standards, human rights, perhaps indigenous peoples. That's related to justice, but it's not justice. And so South Africa's quite unique, I think, in the way you think about just transition through the lens of justice. And so I'm looking at the title, Private Sector Standards and Energy Transition Partnerships. And if we understand that as justice, does it have anything to do with private sector standards? Claude, you've said it's a social contract between people and the government around trust and hope. And therefore, where does the private sector sit in what is actually a social contract around justice? Because most of the ESG standards that we might refer to don't have anything in, justice isn't even mentioned in most ESG standards. So where do you look if you do think the private sector has a role in justice? How is that benchmarked?
I can start just from the private sector standard side. So it's absolutely true. By and large, those frameworks don't cover that. I'm going to ask you to look at the JSE's disclosure guidance on sustainability. It's probably one of the first that actually does start including that. And that was a piece of work that personally I had been very deeply involved in, because at the forefront of leading that project and really starting to say, what does local context look like and how does that translate potentially then into the particular elements that companies should at least be starting to think about. So there are a few in there that are direct indicators, and the expectation is that companies then start disclosing against them, and of course behind that is doing the action that enables that disclosure. So I think from a standards perspective, it's going to be around describing the features that will lend the conversation on the justice. Because I think what we're saying here is that, we don't even agree entirely what that means, but we have frameworks. And South Africa, I think, is leading in considerations of what justice means. And so it's going to be probably incumbent on us to lead again in relooking at what those standards need to look like and what works for us. And it's not about the standards per se, but it is about the impact and the outcome of what that standard is going to deliver on. And so there is a parallel with sustainability and ESG standards more generally, because the shift has been away from reporting for reporting's sake to actually understanding impact and outcome. And in that context, of course, that's because we're looking at planetary boundaries, we're looking at social context and things like that. It's not enough to just say, I have a policy. So what is that a policy achieved, and how do you measure that in terms of impact? That is really what we're after, not the fact that the policy exists. So I think those are the parts where, again, a conversation on what the features and what the impact is that we're looking for, that one will almost have to reverse engineer now into what does that mean potentially for standards, guidelines, frameworks, that will help people think through this. And yeah.
So I could just add one thing, and that is that I think we're going to test this notion quite practically in this funding platform that we're setting up, because we're going to start using some of the standards that have been set and test them as to whether those are the criteria against which projects will be judged for the allocation of grant funding for the just transition. And I think in doing that, and it's an exercise we still need to do, and it's going to have to be a participatory exercise, so it could take a little bit of time, but we have to get it right. And then we invite the corporate world to bring their corporate social investment money to that platform for its application against those standards. And I think that will be a real test as to whether we are able to show the use of those resources in transformative just application. And yeah, I think the jury's out. I think you're right. But we are very determined to get this right, because there are significant resources that the private sector has available, and not just in investment capital, but in corporate social investment capital. And we need to channel that. We need to channel it for just outcomes, and we're certainly working on how we can hone in on those standards and those specifications, yeah. So watch the space.
Just a quick one.
do a quick, maybe 2 minutes, and then I think we'll take one question, then we have to start wrapping up.
Okay. No, just a quick one. I think we need to agree. I think that's what is coming. That just for South Africa is not just for England, for America, but the structural transformation we are looking at is not just for energy, but for the entire economy. Now, it seems in your question that we don't understand it. And for me, companies also need to be capacitated. And I totally agree with my panelists. But what I'm adding is that just as we want to capacitate communities, companies, private sector also need to be trained on what just or justice will mean in the current context. The assumption that the private sector, they know. No, and they know what, no. I think we need to build capacity of private sector, and in that come with the same level with communities, government, what justice or just mean in our context.
Thank you. So I think we have time for one more question, then we are going to have to wrap up, or maybe we'll take two questions together, and I'll give our panelists 1 minute to ask, and then we do have to hand back over to Wiswa. So you can keep it brief.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Alexandra. I'm from International Cooperative Law Research Center, and my comment refers to the scope of just transition. We already talked on the different dimensions and energy access and job losses. And my view that we, as you may know, on Just Transition Work Program, countries trying to find the platform where they can discuss different aspects of just transition, especially from economical side. And my view is here that it's just transition very linked to the economic diversification. And we need to talk also on the local level, transformation, especially local governments, which budget is dependent on the, let's say so, coal finance. Is in some countries, in my country, it's the same situation that we have some cities which are built on mining companies. So company becomes not only the main employer for the city, it becomes the main finance for the city as a whole. Yeah. So my question here is, how do you involve municipalities in this dialogue? How do you work with them? Do you have any plans for economical diversification, for especially for those cities dependent on mining?
Great, thank you. And maybe we'll just take the last question. And I think I'm already looking at you, Sue, to take that question.
Yeah, my name is Dev. My name is Dev Malungisa. I'm with the Southern Africa Resource Watch. I think when we look at justice, it cannot be justice in South Africa, which is different from any part of the world. It must be founded in universal principles, in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, and it must be human rights-based approach. But now when we look at private sector standards, ESG, we are talking of soft law. And for that reason, it's voluntary, and greenwashing cannot be ruled out. The question that I'm seeing, and which I am requesting us to reflect upon, is that the issue of just energy transition right now is more about funding. And that funding, I think, falls within the context of climate financing. And what we may need to do then is to check, apart from the soft law, are there some community rights that are founded in existing laws where they are not given, but communities can claim them using the law. And we find those in the environmental laws in terms of the NEMA in South Africa. And if we really think through that, then it will assist us to also ensure that these are not voluntary measures, but we're looking for justice as you call it justiciable. Rights must be claimed in using impartial judicial mechanisms and so forth. But right now we are not yet there. And the discourse must actually graduate towards rights that are founded in law. And the opportunity may be lying in that, the law right now is behind the climate action. Many countries don't have climate framework legislation that can articulate the question of justice. And if we are having a bill or an act, climate act in South Africa, we must interrogate it so that it is that framework which can guarantee within the constitutionalism of South Africa's democratic practices. Otherwise, it's going to be a very fruitless exercise, and I'm afraid that justice cannot be different from justice. We know it should be universal. There's a tradition. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So we have 1 minute left, and I still want to give a chance to Vuyiswa to close, but maybe I'll just ask for a quick reflection, and there's always time maybe afterwards as we're wrapping up if there's any other questions, but unfortunately we have to prepare for the next event here. We're out of time. So any reflections?
Sure.
Maybe
the municipal question is huge. We have exactly the same issue in South Africa, where whole communities and cities and towns are completely dependent on the mining operations. And not only that, the mines themselves have provided services, clinics and schools and roads and infrastructure, which are really the jobs of municipalities. So there's a massive transformation at a municipal level. We're very aware of it. We've put it in as a specific portfolio in our implementation plan, and we've got a number of steps that we are looking at to address that. So yeah, I don't know how to answer that quickly. And the legal issue is absolutely spot on. I mean, you have to have a legal recourse to protect the very standards that we're trying to set in the just transition. So I think we've got a lot of work to do.
Yeah. And there are a number of events on the implementation plan this week, so I think this conversation will be unpacked, so make sure you check the schedule.
Yeah.
Maybe just any closing reflections from the panel at this stage, otherwise I will...
No, I just want to agree that we need the voluntary approach will not work. So the ESGs, the CSR need to be...
It's got to have some teeth.
Some teeth. Just to close, if you want to understand some of the facts around the discussion, we've got some publication on NDC, South Africa, critical minerals and energy transition that we put up quickly. That's on the table there. You can collect one going.
Great.
Fantastic. Well, I think maybe a huge thank you to the panel. Maybe it's not easy questions, short space of time, but I think the detail is starting to emerge, and we're learning by doing. But I'd like to ask Vuyiswa from the Ford Foundation maybe to close us out, and we'll then keep moving.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Alan. Hi, everyone. Just to thank the panel for a really great conversation, and I mean also the great questions from our audience. So I think for me, just to kind of really quickly highlight some of the things I felt are still missing. Firstly, just to acknowledge that there's a lot that's happened. There seems to be a lot of goodwill, to work together to do the right thing. But I think we're still far from, where we need to be. And two of the glaring things for me, at least even just listening to the conversation, were the need to center communities more. Firstly, even in this conversation, even in this room, the communities are glaringly missing. That's the one thing. And then the other thing is the issue of gender and women. I know it came up, a little bit, but how, because women are definitely disproportionately affected by everything we've spoken about today. So there is a need to do a lot more to center gender and to center women. And I kept wondering, what does an all-of-society approach look like? How do we let our guards down and begin to work together? Because again, coming back to the issue of there seems to be a willingness to work together, but I don't think we have the tools to do it right. So, for instance, I work for the Ford Foundation, and the Ford Foundation is a social justice philanthropy. Now, if you're talking about justice, and there was no mention of philanthropy at all, and the role that philanthropy could play, you know, in also maybe a facilitating role in how do we bring all of the stakeholders together, because we do tend to be trusted, not always, but I mean, generally speaking, we do tend to be seen as a neutral player. So what role can philanthropy play, for an example, in bringing stakeholders together and in, you know, in partnering with everyone, you know, to make sure that indeed the justice part of the transition is not, you know, the poor cousin of everything else. So yeah, a lot is yet to be done, but I'm hopeful. I'm really, really hopeful after this conversation, and I'm putting the challenge out there, particularly to the sectors we don't necessarily always work with, which is government and business. I mean, we have an in with civil society by and large, but we're putting ourselves out there to say we can also, you know, play a role with government, with business, to you know, to kind of play that facilitative role as needed. But thanks everyone again. Yeah, and thank you, Hayley, for all your work in putting this together.
Yes,
thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.